It's time now for the final session of the afternoon and of this conference. The topic, Regulation in the 21st Century. The moderator for this session, the Director General of the OUR, Mr. Zia Mian.
Thank you very much indeed. We have had busy 2 days, and I have been really pleased with the participation we have had. And we come to the last session, which basically is to deal, we are in a new century and how the things will be done in the new century. Because I think it was about 2 weeks ago, Minister and myself both were in Dubai at the ITU Telecom World 2012, where we were discussing issues and the challenges which face the small island economies. And Jamaica and most of our partners and close trade associates are small island economies. And that is one of the major challenges we face in the 21st century. Then we are dealing with the communication, we are dealing with the ability to get the content, ability to be able to deal with the power which is necessary for our economies to keep humming. Then next to it is the issue of the convergence of utilities, not convergence of ICT alone, because it's not ICT, yes, it converged, but what has happened is that the cost of infrastructure in these economies is extremely high. And what we have to be looking at is that how we deal with those cost factors, how we share the infrastructure, not only within the ICT, but across various utilities, which includes the power sector, the smart grids, which will be using extensive technology and will be also a conduit for broadband. Then there are the issues of convergence of regulation, because once you have the convergence of utilities, the regulation will converge, and that is what the trend is taking place all over the world. When we are looking at the large economies like Spain and Holland, what we find is that rather than splitting the regulation, they are bringing it together because there are economies of scale. There are also common issues among various sectors. This this afternoon of the last session, we have a distinguished panel, which is the participants are the minister from STEM, responsible for technology. And we have Chris Daring, who is the chairman of LIME and is dealing with the issues which concern the entire Caribbean, not only Jamaica. Then David Geddes, who is representing Albert Gordon, who was unable to make, talking about the issues which are with the power, with the water sector. And then I have specifically asked David Cox from ECTEL, who is dealing with the Eastern Caribbean issues. He's a lawyer with ECTEL. And then the deputy chairman of ORCA in Bahamas, which is our former Director General, J.P. Morgan. And it's a distinguished panel, and I will start with the minister to make his opening statement, and then each one of us will make a statement, and then we will open up the discussion, the floor, and among the panelists themselves. Thank you. Minister.
Thank you very much, Zio. Good afternoon, everybody. Special welcome to colleagues who may be visiting from the rest of the Caribbean and other places. I'll just briefly highlight some of the issues that I think regulators have to deal with. The 21st century will present us with a number of serious challenges, and from the perspective of energy, I'd like to speak on two in particular: the matter of energy security, and secondly, environmental risks, including climate change. We have experienced continued instability, and our experiences over the last 40 years teach us that oil prices are extraordinarily vulnerable. And we have had, if you examine the impact economically of oil in Jamaica, we spent last year 2.25 billion US dollars importing oil, which constitutes about 30% of our GDP, exceeds the totality of all our exports. Geopolitics and demand drives prices up, and even though there is hope that technological advances in drilling, geological survey techniques, and refining may make more unconventional oil available, which could possibly drive down prices, there is still a tremendous amount of uncertainty. This is one reason why the government is committed to a process of diversification and identifying other sources of energy. Whether oil prices remain high or go down, we have to examine other sources, and natural gas is one which we are pursuing. Whatever the future holds, which we can't predict, we need to protect ourselves from the uncertainty. To mitigate this, we need more kinds of fuels and energy generations coming onto the market. Regulation must be such that it becomes easier for new generators using new fuels to enter our market so that we can diversify our energy mix. The function of the regulator is, after all, to substitute for competition where imperfections in the market exist, and to foster competition where it can. And we need a functional and competitive market in electricity generation. While generation in Jamaica in principle, well, in practice actually, is competitive, the market remains concentrated, and it is questionable whether we benefit from the competition which exists in generation in terms of what our end users have to pay in terms of the electricity prices. Regulation needs to solve this challenge. The OUR is therefore a critical implementer of our policy of diversification, and there are a number of regulatory measures which must come into play as we move forward. For example, one of the prime options right now on the table is natural gas, and gas sector regulation must become a part of our new regulatory environment. The government has actually started working on that with support from our World Bank. Another option is nuclear energy, and this is something which frightens a lot of persons and would require serious regulation in order for us to comply with strict international standards. While the technology is moving to a scale and a price that Jamaica can contemplate in nuclear, we are actually not quite ready as yet. With an eye on the future, we need to do the regulatory work so that we can roll the wicket for this an energy source for the future. Another future energy source, which we are particularly keen on as a government, is examining renewable energy. And we have set a goal of achieving 30% of our total energy mix to be from renewable sources by the year 2030. We are currently now only at about 9%, which means we have a significant challenge in getting to that 2030 figure. Renewables have the benefit of being inherently local and in our highly priced environment uniquely competitive. This is why we are looking at making investment in renewable energy feasible without increasing the prices to our consumers. And the government is in the process now of completing a study, a feed-in tariff study, which will determine the prices at which individuals or companies who are generating renewable energy sources would sell back to the grid. On the matter of renewable energy in particular, we must also recognize another imperative. Jamaica has a leadership role among developing countries, and in particular small island developing states in climate change negotiations. To continue our leadership role, we must also be environmental leaders. The price of energy is important, absolutely, but we must also ensure that in our energy production, that low emission are a part of what we focus on, not just for carbon, but for sulfur oxides, nitrogen oxides, and fine particles, which we know have negative health impacts. For waste to energy in particular, there are water quality and community quality of life issues. This underscores why we need regulation that encourages renewable development alongside conventional electricity generation and does so in a way which reduces the price to our consumers. Renewables have positive environmental externalities that regulation does not actually capture. Further to these environmental issues, we must also speak of the issue of climate change. This is not just about emissions reduction, even though Jamaica can do valuable things in this regard. But we must also speak about climate change adaptation. We must speak about building resilience to extreme weather events, which one of our renowned scientists, Professor Anthony Chen, tells us will be a feature of the 21st century and that we have to prepare for it. Therefore, regulation must work with public-private partnerships and government policy to move the country forward towards resilient infrastructure. As well as adding more distributed capacity, building resilience requires change in our infrastructure. That could mean greater investment in reinforced poles. It could mean underground infrastructure. It could also be smart grid technology, and the government is looking at developing a smart grid, smart energy roadmap through support from the World Bank. In addition to allowing greater efficiency of energy usage and demand-side management, smart grids facilitate distributed generation and more basically can speed up fault detection and maintenance and thereby ensure that we can bounce back quicker from disruptions. The final area I just want to speak briefly about is the issue of transportation. While we have spoke primarily of electricity, electricity is only one component of our energy mix, and transportation is a huge part of our overall energy consumption. While there are interactions between the transport sector and the electricity sector, i.e. electric cars, which are facilitated also by smart grid technologies, we must move towards innovative regulation that will affect public transportation in a positive way. The OER regulates, I didn't actually notice, fares for public transportation, but there are other ways in which the transport sector can be regulated with energy in mind. Some of these may fall within the OER or probably outside, maybe the Ministry of Transport. But there are some which I think we can't escape and which we will have to examine. Congestion taxes, for example, are a form of regulation that have worked in other countries to reduce the overall consumption of transportation fuels, particularly when paired with robust public transportation and fuel efficiency standards. On the area of technology, and I don't think we necessarily share the same perspectives as the OER, we believe that having a single regulator in the technology sector is something which is important, required, and something which the government is moving apace at. Currently, the OUR provides regulation, the Broadcasting Commission also provides regulation, and the Spectrum Management Authority also provides regulation within our ICT sector. Having three regulators, we think, creates a level of inefficiency for market players, and we believe having a single regulator for the ICT sector would reduce some of those efficiencies, allow the regulator to respond more quickly to changes in market conditions, and ensure that we provide the support for a very competitive environment in the ICT sector. So that is something that the government has started work on, something which we hope to implement by the year 2014. Thank you very much.
Now I will ask Chris Daring to take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Director General. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I think as somebody who is fairly relatively new to the telecoms industry, I've learned quite a bit over the last couple of years that I've actually been involved in this industry. And I've also worked a substantial number of years in another industry in Jamaica that was probably even more heavily regulated, and that's the banking industry. And so the first observation that I'd like to make is that unless we modernize our regulatory environment in Jamaica, we will never be able as a country, I think, to take advantage of not just the tremendous opportunities that exist, but turning the challenges that we know exist into even further opportunities. And one of the areas that I think we need to dramatically modernize our regulatory environment is just in the area of speed. And if you just think about the rate of change of technology, where you buy a smartphone in January and by June it's outdated and you're embarrassed in front of your friends, you recognize that if the regulatory environment isn't keeping up with just that pace of change of technology, we're falling way behind the rest of the world. And so, as the minister, I'll pick up where the minister left off since this time in terms of having a single regulatory body that manages the ICT and manages all our national assets. I think it's going to be very important going forward. If you just take in point, last year or January, we did something that was unprecedented in Jamaica. We actually televised a live concert from Miami on Jamaican mobile handsets. And a lot of people think of it, sure, it's a marketing gimmick. But if you think about what that meant in terms of a technological revolution, that you could actually have a live concert televised in Jamaica, being staged in Miami, televised live in Jamaica on mobile phones. It really shows you the sort of gamut of opportunity for this country. Because in this digital world, content is king. And Jamaica, I've always felt, and I still believe, is at least a king in the world of content, at least a crown prince in the world of content. We are living, breathing content in this country, and unless we put in place the kind of regulatory environment that fosters investment in this living, breathing content that we have called Jamaica, we'll never be able to take advantage of it. And one of the major impediments is speed of decision making. And so if you look on mobile television, the fact that we televise that concert, think about the gamut of regulatory agencies and organizations that we would have had to have dealt with. The SMA for Spectrum, the Broadcast Commission for Broadcasting, the Ministry, of course, and of course the OUR on the telecommunications side, because we're dealing on mobile handsets. So it is this massive convergence of all these technological platforms that is going to pose a tremendous challenge to organizations like the OUR, who are dealing with telecommunications like every other utility, when it requires such a specialized and significant amount of resources to keep a pace with the rest of the world in terms of the telecommunications needs and technological changes, that you see it's going to be an incredible challenge, I think, for the OUR to keep up with that. And of course, then there's a national need in terms of what is the strategy. How are we going to deploy and manage our national assets of spectrum? Because what we have now is where virtually technology is being regulated. So if you look on fixed line, we have a regulatory environment for fixed line services. But the reality is what we're trying to, fixed line is just one of many ways to make a voice call or deliver internet. And then who is your regulatee? Is it the person that's providing the internet service? What about those major competitors that, for instance, Lime now has, that are far bigger than Lime? People call Skype, people call Magic Jack. These organizations that simply can come over the top on the infrastructure that has been invested in by companies like Lime and compete with us. And who is regulating them? If we launch television, overall fixed line services, are we really providing fixed line services, or are we providing entertainment? And who's regulating our competitors in that sphere? Netflix and Apple TV, all of whom have extremely compelling products, much more scale than Lime, because they're dealing with a global marketplace. But we're the ones that are regulated, and they're not. So I definitely would support the minister's call for a single regulatory environment to look at all of our telecommunications opportunities, chart a course for this country to utilize those facilities that will benefit not just the country, but the companies that operate within that industry. And I want to get back to that element of speed, because justice denied or delayed is justice denied. It's a common cliche. Until you can make very quick decisions that are binding, we will never get anywhere. And even decisions that are adverse to a particular competitor, the reality is once that decision is made and made quickly, you can adjust. As an entrepreneur, you know the lay of the land, you can move forward with whatever plans you need to implement based on any particular ruling. You can't have a situation where any regulator isn't empowered to make decisions quickly, good or bad. It's almost better you make a quick bad decision than a slow good decision. And so what we would certainly implore the ministry, the regulators, to look at the legislation that is needed to empower whichever new regulatory direction we take, so that decisions can be made quickly, implemented quickly. There's quick redress in whatever legislative framework is also put in place. I mean, I was absolutely shocked coming into the regulator industry here. And I was virtually used to a regulatory industry in banking, where the Bank of Jamaica's pronouncements was law, you had to abide by it. There was no appealing and taking it to court and so on, because you're dealing with, customers' deposits and other people's money, so there was a fair degree of autonomy given to the Bank of Jamaica in terms of the regulatory framework. But in the telecommunications sector, you had this scenario where things could simply be dragged out in court for years and years and years. And it just, something that we can't allow to continue. We have to put in place, from just putting on a national hat now, a regulatory environment that decisions are made quickly and we move forward. Good or bad for the individual competitors, we can all live with that as entrepreneurs. Once we know what is the lay of the land, things can't be delayed indefinitely. Really long are gone the days of that a telecommunications player is looking at voice as its revenue. And therefore, whatever national infrastructure is already in place has to be utilized in many, many ways. But you'll find that the regulatory environment is, of course, doesn't allow that, doesn't facilitate that easily to allow investors who have plunked a lot of money into the ground, into infrastructure, who want to use that infrastructure to do other things, because simply what it used to be able to do is not going to be able to generate a sufficient return on that investment. But there's no place to go to get that particular investment adjusted, changed, new strategies, employed, etc. There's so many agencies you'd have to go to. And of course, none of these individual agencies necessarily buy into what might be a national agenda. So you could have a scenario where the SMA that controls spectrum has its own idea of where spectrum is going to be most valuable from a national perspective. You could have the ministry that might have other objectives. At the end of the day, what we need is our objectives that suit our country and what is best for our country in the short, medium, and long term. And therefore, I really would support the minister's call for a single regulatory agency. Just general points. We must have an appropriate legal and regulatory framework. The regulation must be applied where it is required and must be regularly reviewed to ensure that it remains relevant. That's an important point when you think about the state of technology change and the pace that it takes place. It has to be made, rate adjustments need to be looked at for the benefit of consumers, because at the end of the day, that is what we're all about in terms of making sure consumers get the benefit of that regulation. If I was to look at it in terms of how I would summarize, at the moment, our entire regulatory environment is based almost on a defensive play. But until we put in place the regulatory that can foster, drive, develop investment in this particular area, we will forever miss out on the opportunity. Thank you.
I now call upon David Geddes to take the podium.
Good afternoon. A little bit of deja vu here. Let me just clarify a few things. Thank you, moderator. First off, and this time I'm making sure to wear my glasses, I am not here again this afternoon because my presentation was that good this morning. Actually, I'm here because our president is at the Yalas pipeline, where we have several significant breaks, which could spell disaster for us very shortly. Also, several persons came to me after my presentation this morning asking me if I was returning to the OUR. Let me clarify what my statement was. I said I was not going to bite the hand that fed me, nor that which is likely to feed me again. I was speaking about lunch, not returning, yes, not returning to the OUR. Let me just clarify that because, yes, seem to have been things. Also, I'm wearing a different hat, so my comments will very likely be a little different from those this morning, seeing that I'm sitting in for the president. So let me be very careful this time. As our lawyers would say, my instructions have now been changed. So, I may not be quite in tandem with what was said this morning, which was my own views. Just very quickly also, this debate about a single regulator, just putting on the table that NWC is not clamoring for a single regulator in water. We're mindful of the regulatory fees, and so we are quite happy to proceed the way we are. As I said, as it relates to water, we'll not get involved with the debate on telecommunications. I don't have those instructions yet. Okay, first I believe that when we look at regulation in the 21st century, first I believe that we must agree what is regulation. Now, some consumers, even some regulators, tend to hold the belief that regulation is another layer of management at the utility company. Others tend to think that regulation is a hindsight coach, where you castigate the companies in the aftermath of the management making strategic decisions. That is not regulation. It often appears that omniscient regulators are desirous of substituting management's strategic decisions with regulatory oversight. And here I agree with Chairman Deering about the need to make timely decisions. Wouldn't go as far as to say that it's better to have, well, I just won't go any further than that. But I will just say that I completely agree that we need timely decisions. And again, to reiterate that, regulators must not substitute their regulatory oversight for management strategic decisions. To my mind, regulation in the 21st century must protect consumers' interests while allowing opportunities for utility companies to make returns on their investment. Again, that involves strategic business decisions. This is not the purview of regulators. Regulation in the 21st century must strategically engage their stakeholders, most importantly consumers. As we heard this morning, consumers are the least organized stakeholder in the regulatory environment. In this 21st century, we need to ensure that consumers' interests are taken on board and that there is some creative approach to getting their engagement. Today and tomorrow's regulator must be accessible to all stakeholders and create effective opportunities for consultation. I mentioned this morning, and I'll reiterate, that there needs to be significantly more interest in the operations of particularly the OUR, the office, which is comprised of the Director General and the Deputy Directors General. So again, we ask who is eligible to attend the regulatory meetings of the office. Stakeholders must see regulation and regulators' deliberations at work. So therefore, part of that should be, an objective should be, that the meetings be open to the public. Regulation must be delivered in the 21st century by competent persons. And here, and I'm not casting any aspersions here, we don't wish to go the road of persons being appointed because of affiliation to political parties, where allegiance is the only attribute for leading the regulatory agency. We believe that competence is what must be at the forefront in the 21st century. The 21st century regulation must be transparent and strategic. It must involve all persons. You need the 21st century regulatory body must have talented staff who are properly compensated and committed to the task at hand. I thank you.
I now ask David Cox to take the podium and enlighten us about what is happening in the Eastern Caribbean and the region.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I will like to begin by offering an apology. I only became aware that I would be making this presentation a few minutes ago. So my presentation will be deliberately short, and I apologize if I'm not able to cover as many points as I would like. The first thing I want to talk about, but before I do that, let me just sort of set the scene a little bit. I want to thank Zia in particular for the kind invitation to ECTEL to be here, and to thank the staff of the OUR. I want to, coming from the Eastern Caribbean, I cannot express the level of amazement in a way. I mean, the Jamaican people have always been impressive in the Caribbean, and that is true whether it is in sports, in politics, or in anything else, and it is true in the field of regulation. And the last 2 days have put in perspective for me that the OUR continues to blaze a trail for the Caribbean in terms of the work that it is doing in regulation. And of course, because you are a largely Jamaican audience, you will not perceive the level of excellence or the level of progress in the same way I do as an outsider. But consider that we were having a discussion just earlier today about the fact that consumers need to be consulted more and need to have a greater say in the development of regulation in Jamaica and in the processes of the OUR, and consider that the OUR has a consumer protection division and staff, however badly paid, dedicated to consumer protection issues. And then, by contrast, consider that in the ECTEL region where I come from, which represents 5 states, that is Dominica, Grenada, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and St. Kitts, that the national telecoms regulators in those states have no consumer protection, no express consumer protection mandate, and no consumer protection institution, infrastructure internally. So I say that not to suggest that in Jamaica all is well, and that you do not have very serious structural or political or other types of issues to overcome. But I say that merely to illustrate the point that I think that you are certainly far further ahead than many of the rest of us, and that I think confidently say that you are getting the fundamentals right. And I think that is borne out, because I'm a lawyer, I have a bias for this particular perspective, but I think that is borne out, again, in the results of the various legal challenges that have come up in the area of telecoms that the OUR has been involved in. And again, Jamaica, as in the case with the CCJ and the arguments about that, Jamaica is blazing a trail for the rest of the Caribbean there, because the case, perhaps the most famous case, which came out of Jamaica, involving the role and the influence of the minister and the regulator, has provided incredible clarity for the rest of us in the Caribbean about what is the appropriate role and scope of policy in regulation versus the appropriate role and scope of the regulator, and what independence should in fact look like in reality. So I want to congratulate you and to congratulate the government and the people of Jamaica, because the last 2 days, I think, have emphasized not just the dynamism of the market, not just the complexity of the issues that you face, but they have also emphasized for me in a very inspiring way the reality that you are thinking constantly ahead. I mean, we are now reflecting on 15 years, but the perspective here has not been what has been the lessons of the past. The perspective of the last 2 days has been where are we going to the future? And I think you've got it fundamentally right. And that's my 2 cents for what it's worth. Now, when we talk about, I have a bias because I come from a telecoms regulator, and so I will not focus very heavily on energy or water, although I'll make a few passing comments about that because I think hopefully that you'll find them relevant. But when we talk about convergence, particularly in telecoms, obviously the first thought that tends to spring to mind is this process whereby we see this collapse in the barriers between the traditional, this collapse in technological barriers, essentially, that allows previously separate types of technologies and services and networks to be combined into one. And academics have argued that this process is being driven primarily by 2 things. And the first thing is that they've suggested it's being driven by the rapidly falling price in digital memory. I suppose the best and easiest way to remind us of this is, maybe 10 years ago, if you had to buy a memory card for a mobile phone or a digital camera, and you had to get, say, a 16 gigabyte card or something like that, the price was actually quite prohibitive. And yet, within a year, the price of that same level of memory would go down considerably, and the price of digital memory is falling all the time. And of course, the other driver of convergence is the widespread availability of broadband networks, high-speed internet. And so those 2 things are coming together to produce this collapse that I'm talking about, which is giving rise to this amazing innovation that we're seeing every day. And it's very difficult to keep up with. But the exciting thing about it is that it is opening up possibilities that we had not considered before. Now, one tendency I have observed is that when we think about convergence, often regulators in particular, and sometimes policymakers as well, tend to get flustered. There's a sort of a knee-jerk reaction which can be boiled down in some cases to confusion. It suddenly seems to cause regulatory personnel to think, well, goodness, does this mean we're going to have to change the way we regulate? Does it mean that we're going to have to change our structure? Should we become a sector-specific type structure versus a multi-sector regulator? Should we combine the regulation of broadcasting with the regulation of the telecoms networks? Should we take that out from energy, et cetera? And I think that's exactly the discussion, although I well recognize that discussion that's going on in Jamaica now is not convergence specific. I'm just using that as an example of something that can happen. And the issues that convergence throws up, I do admit, can sometimes be troubling. They don't admit to easy or pat answers all the time. And to sort of illustrate this, I thought maybe the quickest way would be to illustrate with this example. Consider the issue of whether or not a network operator should have the authority to place restrictions on the kind of information you receive over the internet or have access to. Should a network operator, for example, be entitled to restrict your use of certain types of services that perhaps may directly compete with the services that operator provides? So should a network operator place limits on your ability to use Skype or WhatsApp or FaceTime or any other service which could legitimately cut into its revenue? On the other hand, should a regulator have the authority to determine what your business is? Should the regulator have the ability to tell you to make your strategic management decisions? I mean, if you're in the business of selling certain services and and people can use that services in ways that you didn't anticipate or that the technology is enabling, that may cut down ultimately in your revenue, does the regulator have the right to tell you how to run your business, what you should sell? Now, if you think about it in those terms, that is and bear in mind, that example that I've just given you is an example which is purely before us because of the process of convergence. Wouldn't be possible if that collapse in the barriers to technology hadn't happened before. And how is a regulator supposed to respond in those circumstances? How do you deal with that? I mean, is it something that you can answer with a robust technical analysis? Can you set prices based on an objective economic analysis? How do you deal with that? The fact is that it is true. There are no easy answers to these issues, and I suspect that, in fact, the answers may not be available to regulators through the traditional means. I suspect that the answers to some of the questions, and just some of the questions, will have to be resolved by one thing, and it is the most important thing in any circumstance, and that is by public policy. What is ultimately the public policy determined by applying principles steeped in your democratic ethos and also in terms of your aspirations about your own cultural identity. It's like lawyers will tell you that there are some legal questions these are hard questions which do not admit to easy legal analysis. And in these gaps, they must be determined essentially by matters of policy, and judges will have to step into those breaches. And in the same way, when regulating certain issues that are going to be thrown up in this century, they are going to have to be determined on public policy principles, on the basis of principles that you adopt that have some relevance in some larger set of beliefs. But whatever the case about that, my central thesis is that regulation remains fundamentally the same in this century, the previous century, or the next. Because the fundamentals of regulation are essentially about three things, and we've been talking about them here today, over the last 2 days. We just haven't talked about them in those terms. The fundamentals of what you do when you regulate are three things. The fundamentals are, is your regulation accountable? Is it transparent? And is it independent? When we were having a conversation earlier today about the role that consumers must play and the potential arrogance of regulators, what we are talking about is about the accountability of a regulator to a major constituency, which is consumers. I sometimes joke that regulators are kind of the battered women of government institutions, in the sense that it's like as a regulator you are caught between government on the one hand, the private sector on the other hand, and the consumers on the other hand, on the third hand. And sometimes the tensions or the objectives are diametrically opposed. You simply cannot meet, and Mark is correct, that your role sometimes is to disappoint everyone. And probably when you are disappointing everyone, it may be that you're actually doing your job. But because you are at the center of these relationships, your fundamental responsibility always is to be accountable to those partners. You have to be accountable in a direct way for the funds that you receive from Parliament. You have to be accountable to Parliament for the implementing policy that a legitimate government has adopted. You have to be accountable in a direct way to consumers who expect you to step in when the market fails. And you have to be accountable to the providers who are employers, who make investments, who pay taxes, and without whom you wouldn't exist, and without whom consumers wouldn't benefit. The issue of consumer protection also is directly related to a question of transparency, and I'm just using this discussion that we had today just to illustrate that irrespective of whether it's water, electricity, whether we're talking about the telecoms in a converged environment, whether we are talking about regulation in 1960 or whether we are talking about regulation in 2024, those three fundamentals, accountability, independence, transparency, will always be fundamental. They cannot be avoided. And so my thesis is that when we're talking about regulation in the 21st century, we shouldn't, it would be a mistake to think about too much about the specific structure the regulator will take. It would be a mistake to think too much about the particular sector or technology that the regulator has to deal with. It would be a mistake to focus on those things. And rather what we should focus on are systems that strengthen accountability, systems that strengthen independence, regulatory independence, and systems that strengthen transparency. We can talk as well about things like the convergence of regulations and the convergence of regulators. But again, I think the same principles hold true. I will just end by making a few closing observations about what I think the substance. I spoke about these fundamental principles which I think will transcend, which are enduring. But at least with respect to electronic communications, ICTs, telecoms, etc., my belief is that more and more what we will eventually be concerned about is the market for ideas, the market for information. The world is fundamentally going to be about information. And in a developmental context, in the context of sustainable development and the role between regulation and development, the role of the regulator in that century, assuming those three principles are strong, is going to be about ensuring that there is a playing field that makes access to information, access to ideas, that makes the market for ideas as competitive as possible. That's where I think the substance, that's what I think you're eventually going to be regulating in 20 or 30 years. It's not so much this network or that network, but what is the most efficient way of delivering ideas? What is the most efficient processes for protecting access to ideas? And finally, I wanted to close with two questions, really. And these questions have to do with the other sectors that we were talking about in the last couple of days, namely water and electricity. And I wanted to thank the minister in particular, who I thought, coming from the region that I do, it's extremely exciting and refreshing to hear a politician who's actually clear. Very clear, I thought, on what he thought the challenges were. That kind of clarity, I think, is rare, and particularly in these fields is critically important. I wanted to ask two questions, and the first question was, there is an assumption that the problems that we face will have to be solved by regulation. And I'm wondering whether that is really the right way to look at it. I want to suggest that perhaps it isn't that these problems can be solved by regulation, but rather that the problems will have to be solved by policy, and that regulation will aid in that respect. And then the other thing that I wanted to do is that, what other question I wanted to ask is, what is the role of the private sector in that drive, in that move toward the future? And I'm asking that specifically in the context of Jamaica. Because and I'm asking specifically because I do not know enough about the local circumstances in order to offer a view. But I want to suggest in closing that that issue, that question, is an important question to have in the forefront of thinking about regulation in the future and thinking about diversification of energy and thinking about these issues. That if we think of policy as being important to set the framework, if we think of policy as being the signposts and regulation as being the mechanism by which we enforce, then where does government need to stop, and how can the private sector be cajoled, influenced, pulled, coaxed into stepping into some of the breaches that we're seeing now? And I think if we can maybe we can come up with a few answers to those questions, that perhaps we can make some progress on some of the challenges that we're facing now. Thank you very much for being such a patient audience, and thank you again to Zia and to the OUR for having me here. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David, for accepting the challenge and in such a short notice delivering an excellent presentation. I now ask J.P. Morgan to come and enlighten us with his own views. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Boy, suppose David Cox had had a lot of notice to prepare. but like David Cox, I had very short notice. But trust me, I won't speak as long. Well, let me just thank Zia and the OER for inviting me. And in a sense, I'm wearing my personal hat, but I guess a lot of the comments I might make would probably come out of the recent experiences that I've been having as Zia had mentioned in my role at the Bahamian regulator. But before I get there, I had an awful feeling, almost of a knee-jerk, when I listened to Minister Robinson, followed very closely by the chairman of Lime. Because the last time the minister with responsibility for telecoms and the incumbent telecom supplier, meaning it would have been what, TOJ, I guess, at the time, spoke from the same hymn sheet. Spoke from the same hymn sheet. We almost ended up with a situation that, had it been allowed to continue, we'd have ended up with a situation that we wouldn't be speaking today with this fantastic telecoms ICT sector that we have today. So, like I said, I had a little bit of a knee-jerk, as I said, a little bit of a strong sense of deja vu almost when I heard both of them actually speaking from, as I said, from the same hymn sheet. But what they both had to say, I think, clearly has direct relevance to the to how we ought to be positioning ourselves in Jamaica for the future. Now, a century is 100 years, and the topic is regulation in the 21st century. So we're really talking about 100 years. So I want to mix it up a little bit, and say you might regret asking me to make a few comments, because I'm known sometimes to sort of spoil the run-ins, if you like. Just imagine a scenario where we have a completely unbundled, distributed electric network, absolutely competitive. Lime is actually supplying electricity to consumers, not along the power lines that we are traditionally accustomed to, but through some other medium, perhaps along their digital lines, that an electricity is coming down in little packets of energy and being converted at the consumers' connections and so on, interconnection with the network and so on. Just think that that's possible. So you have Lime supplying electricity. On the other hand, you have this infrastructure that GPS has on the ground, and they are supplying television services and perhaps whatever other ICT type services might be available in the year 2090. So the point is this, is that we really don't know what technology is going to do for us over the next 100 years or so. So then, what is the role of the regulator in that type of scenario where, as I said, technology drives it, not laws and regulations and so on? The first thing I think that the regulator has to be and has to do is that he cannot be an inhibitor for development. If he is, then the advances that we're looking forward to, the growth and the sustainable development, the green technology, it won't happen because you'll have a regulator who is actually really a bottleneck to this development. So the first thing I think that we have to fix is to provide that enabling framework where the regulator can take decisions quickly, speed, where he's not constrained by the fact that you're talking about telecommunications service on the one hand, but really it's an electricity service that you're trying to deliver. So he has to be, in my view, absolutely neutral and be unshackled, if you like, by the constraints of tubes and pipes. If we can get to that level of understanding, then I think the role of the regulator then starts to unfold for us. One, the policy frameworks need to, for instance, let me use an example here. I firmly believe, and I'm stepping back now to my OER experience, it's perhaps the only time that I will make a statement like this, but I firmly believe that had the regulator been left with the responsibility of finding the solution for the diversification of fuel in the energy sector, I believe it would have happened by now. I don't know whether the solution, back then, 10 years ago, I don't know whether the solution would have been natural gas, coal, or whatever. But I believe the regulator working with industry, fostering a competitive environment, I believe we would have probably solved that problem by now, and Jamaica and our energy cost concerns would probably have been settled maybe 5 or so years ago. So at the policy level, I think the policymakers have to recognize and free up the regulator in terms of the extent to which it can make these decisions. Again, I sort of chuckled, well, I sort of smiled when the minister spoke about the ministry doing a study on feed-in tariffs, for instance. Should the ministry really be doing this? Is a question that I would ask. My instinctive reaction is no, perhaps it shouldn't be. Setting prices. I'm not sure that policy should be involved in setting prices. To be quite honest with you, I'm not even sure that the regulator these days should be involved in setting prices. I think the marketplace can do that. So I think we have to sort of unblur this relationship between policy and the implementation of policy. I would have liked, for instance, Minister, that policy, I know where it's coming from, I understand the background, to have said, regulator, we want to encourage renewables and we want to encourage it at a price that, we want to fix it at a price that encourages the development of renewables, but at the same time protects consumers. I think with that, the market and the regulator could figure it out. And, you know, because feed-in tariffs, for instance, since we're on that topic, might work in North America. It may not work here, I don't know. But I think between the market and the regulator in Jamaica, we would find the solution. Just a point. I use these examples just to say, just to really illustrate the point in terms of how I see the regulator responding and acting in the period going forward. One last comment, and then that's it. I go back to my original example. You know, my pet thing is that despite the years that I spent trying to manage the JPS license, for instance, I do believe that the regulatory arrangements that we have today perhaps need to be revisited. I spent too much time thinking, unfortunately, now. I made a comment last night. I sometimes wonder, for instance, whether the very license that JPS, for instance, has today, whether in fact it is not an inhibitor to the efficient performance of the company itself. So therefore, in going forward, we have to be careful how we write those instruments. As I said, the regulator needs to position himself where, in the final analysis, he facilitates rather than imposes or prescribes conditions on the industry, on the market, which in fact may make the market inefficient, which is not the intent. So it was a couple of comments. Like I said, I was hoping to mix it up a little bit. I hope I have. And thank you very much, Seal, for the invitation.
I think we have had excellent presentations. All 5 panelists have done a great job. And I hear, well, let us give them an applause. OUR is host of this forum. You would have noticed that during last 2 days, OUR has not interfered or tried to comment on any of the issues which have been discussed, because we are here to listen to. We want the stakeholders and the participants to have a dialogue. We have been facilitating it. Hence, I want to make sure that we do not comment on any of the issues which have been raised here. And they will. So what I'm going to now do is, first I'm going to ask the floor to ask questions of the panelists, and the panelists will respond to them. And if we still have time, I would like the panelists to have a little dialogue among themselves to discuss some of the issues which have been raised, or any of the panelists have a question of another panelist. So with that, and I will suggest that whoever takes the mic, they should first state their name and what agency or otherwise they belong to, and then if they have a question of all the panelists, say so, or if they have a specific panelist question from specific panelists, address the question to that particular panelist. Thank you. Please, please go ahead.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Well, I'm Mian, a member of the Petrojam team here this evening. I listened to the presentations. I get the understanding that the regulator should more or less allow for the expertise of maybe the company, the organization, the wills and desires of the consumer, and also should also bear in the background that the politician who should be directing the policies should also be considered, since I think the politician and the consumer interests are more congruent. But the question I'd like to ask of whoever on the panel or maybe any individual that might answer this question is, as I recall a situation some years ago when the decision was taken internationally that we would want to redundant the type of gases that we use in the AC units. A group taking the decision that we would abandon it from R12 and we're going to another more environmentally friendly gas for refrigeration. And the second one along the same line, which is this one, which has to do with the improvement in the efficiency of motor vehicles. How did maybe the US or the international environment come to the decision that yes, we want to rule out and outlaw R12 and we can get more efficient or more environmentally conscious or friendly replacements? How did they come to this conclusion that yes, they're going to do that? Because I know it was legislated. And also, how was it addressed, or how did it develop that we decided, that the international environment decided that, well, this 18 miles and 12 miles per gallon for motor vehicles should be improved, and it should improve in quick order? How did that come about? Because I know most concerns, more companies will not readily want to give up what they are comfortable with. So how did this arrive at, and how should the regulator operate in an environment like those to make decisions that really ultimately improve the life and well-being of everyone in that regard? So I don't know who wants to give their opinion or idea on it.
And Minister, would you like to take it?
That one is, in cricket parlance, I'll leave that one outside.
How about JP?
I can't really answer it because I really don't know.
Because this is the transport ministry and the transport sector issue, although the transport sector is one of the largest consumer of the petroleum in Jamaica. This is an issue which is part of the transport policy, and I don't think any one of us here is really privy to what the approach is. And
Excuse me. Can you use a microphone, please? Yes, could you use a microphone, please, for recording purposes? Thank you.
I was just saying that the question really is, I understand that it was almost a dictate that yes, R12 must go, and we want a more friendly and environmental solution to that. And the second one, as it has to do with motor vehicles, is that 12 and 13 miles per gallon for each gallon of gasoline is not good enough. And that must also be improved and improved in good order. And if we can recall, like with the refrigerator, with the change in that, the refrigerator consumption at least had to move by maybe 20% per year for the next 5 years, and they did achieve it. But initially, I don't think the company would have wanted to change from what they were comfortable with. So how did the regulator in that environment allow for that, which I know they had to fight for, you know?
First thing is that as far as the efficiency, energy efficiency regulation and the standards are concerned, the OUR is not the one which is involved with that. It is the ministry which is responsible, and between the Ministry of Transport and the Ministry of Energy, there is a dialogue going on in terms of the policy and what kind of energy efficiency improvement measures should be taken. And I believe there is a policy paper which is being drafted between these two ministries, which will result in providing the guidelines and where the country should be going, which includes the mileage standards, includes the this diversification of fuels within the transport sector, the size and the size of the engine which can be brought in. If you will recall, at some time, the government always had this policy where the smaller the engine, less the duty on it, and the larger engines were actually had a higher custom and the GCT on them. But this is an area on which the OUR is not competent authority to make any comment. But if there is any one of the, I think David Cox and the Minister.
Well, let me just say, I wondered the question really, which I have in my mind based on comments J.P. Morgan made, whether the issue is really about what role does government as policy play, as policymakers versus the OUR, versus the regulator, sorry, and where does the government's role start and stop, and where does the regulator start and stop? And there are clear areas where the boundaries may be blurred. I can think of some. The question was asked specifically about should we be involved in feed-in tariffs. That's debatable. The question is if energy consumption, energy prices are such a critical component of national development, and if an administration believes this is an important strategy to accomplishing that, do you take a proactive interventionalist role, or do you allow the regulator to play that role? We can have a debate about that, and there are many other examples. Who defines development? Mr. Morgan again said the regulator shouldn't be an inhibitor to development, but the concept of development from a policy perspective as a government may be very different from what the regulator sees it as. So I'm not necessarily saying we have all the answers, but the question you've asked has spurred my own questions about where policy starts and stops, and the issue of energy again. When you think about the impact it has on our own economy, it is, I would say, the single greatest impediment to economic growth. So what do you do as an administration? Do you say, fine, I will leave it to the regulator to determine how we get to that 30% of renewables by 2030, or do you play a more proactive role?
David Cox, you were...
Yes, actually, I wanted to back up the minister. I cannot answer your question in a specific way. I can give you an answer which has general applicability, and it's a one-word answer, and it's leadership. Those things that you talked about happened because governments ultimately took a decision to set standards, and then the regulator had the responsibility of implementing those standards, of monitoring those standards, and of enforcing those standards. But all regulation begins with leadership. It begins, and that leadership is expressed through policy. And we can talk about the way policy is developed, and the fact that it's influenced by a number of factors. And sometimes governments are pushed and pulled. But it's leadership nonetheless. Let me just use a very, very hopefully brief example. In the Eastern Caribbean, the governments there took a decision to liberalize because, and it was an internally driven decision, and they provided real leadership. But they took that decision because a banana industry was in collapse because of the WTO. There were a number of factors that influenced the decision that they made. They recognized that there was a need to diversify their economic basis and to bring the prices of the cost of doing business down. So there were a lot of factors that influenced that leadership, but what they did was they set the broad parameters, and the most important decision they made was the market had to be liberalized. And I think that just in the context of this discussion that we're having today, that is the most important thing that you need to figure out in the context of talking about where you're going in Jamaica in terms of energy, where you're going in Jamaica in terms of regulation. It's about leadership. What is the vision? And once you've established that, then the mechanics of it fall into place.
Thank you. Glenn?
Yes, Glenn Can, regulator from Trinidad. You know, 2 decades or more ago, I visited Washington, D.C., and whenever I go to countries, I like to visit historical sites and that type of thing, and libraries. So I went to the Thomas Jefferson Monument. And I always remember what I read on the wall there, and I'm paraphrasing that now. And he said that he was not an advocate for changes in laws and constitutions, but that he could not require a man to wear the coat that he wore when he was a boy, and therefore he had to concede that there was need for some change. But having said that, and being a regulator, I recognize that in Trinidad we had something called the PUC, which regulated 5 different sectors. And then that was closed down and the RIC came into being, which is the organization I now represent. And when that came into being, it was regulating 3 sectors, including telecoms. And then in 2005, there became a separate telecoms regulator. Now I want to tell you, I have seen really no advantage in that transition. In fact, 1 week before I came here, I saw an advertisement where the telecoms regulator was advertising for 8 positions vacant. Now that means that 8 people would have left, because I'm sure it wasn't 8 additional positions that they were putting on. What that suggests to me is after 7 years, the institution is still trying to find its way and is not strong enough to deal with the issues that it's dealing with. And I'm hearing Mr. Dering saying that there should be a new regulator. If I have to advise on that, I would say that makes no sense at all. I'm not telling you what to do, but from my perspective, 2 weeks ago I gave a talk at the university in Trinidad, and I was telling the people, one of the failings of Caribbean people, and I'm a regionalist at heart, I was born before the Federation, and I wish the Federation was still here. What I tell them is, you know, what we seem to do, if something is not working, we say, look, let's close this down, start something new. We don't seem to understand that the best way to do things is to strengthen what you already have. And that is my advice. Strengthen what you have and don't try to start something new.
Yes, please.
I think the major point which I'm trying to make is that we need to adapt to a totally different environment. Nobody's talking about having a new regulator, but certainly you need to have convergence of the regulatory agencies, just as you have a convergence of the technologies. So rather than, for instance, regulating fixed line, which is the technology, you really maybe want to regulate the service. And therefore, by regulating all voice services, then you bring everybody into the framework. Similarly, because of the convergence of what you're able to do with the different technologies and different platforms, the fact that an entrepreneur, and forget the existing ones, any new entrepreneur, if they wanted to launch a television service in this country that required, say, spectrum based on the developing technologies, they would have to deal with SMA, one set of people who may not have any idea really of the overall policy directives of the Broadcasting Commission, who then have to also deal with, maybe they have to want to offer some voice services or internet services. It's a totally different regulator. So what we're talking about is bringing them under one house. I'm not advocating whether it should be a new regulator, but certainly we need to bring a convergence so that you have one shop that is managing our national assets, and therefore when you do have a policy direction of a ministry, which as David would have indicated would have been developed based on everybody's input, then you can get decisions made very quickly in a unified fashion, in a uniform fashion. So that's what I'm advocating for. It doesn't have to be new, but I can't see the sense of having so many different regulators now when you're talking about a converged set of services. And just, since JP made a quip about the fact that the minister and the incumbent, even that which just says to me, you know, there's a need to recognize that the things have so dramatically changed.
You're no longer the incumbent.
We're no longer the incumbents. And if you don't, I give an example of what I'm talking about. And since David Cox is here too, I mean, it's a good opportunity to market to him as well. We had a meeting a few months ago with all the unions that we deal with across the patch. And there was an operating board that runs Lime across the entire Caribbean. The four of us that run Lime across the Caribbean. And the unions were all, I mean, they started with the same stories. Oh, in 1996, you guys did this. In 2002, you guys did this, and so on. And I had to interrupt the meeting. I said, listen, guys. First of all, do you recognize that I'm the oldest member of this operating board, by far, by many years. And I have no recollection of anything you're talking about. Things are just so changed in the market that even the personnel across all the companies are changed. Totally different. So you need to fix that knee.
Anybody else?
Yeah,
Yes,
no, just to come back, I pick up on Glenn's point and which thing. You know, I actually really believe and I support the notion that there has to be convergence with the regulators in the ICT telecom sector. The other authority, which I'm now spend some time on, it's a fully converged regulator. In fact, we actually even handle broadcasting and content, and that is perhaps the most interesting aspect of it, to tell you the truth. I'm not sure myself whether that converged regulator need to be involved with content. That, for me, is, you know, the one to put in the box. For me, the question is, having converged the ICT regulators, which I think must happen. The question is, where do you put it? Do you establish it as a separate standalone regulator, or do you bring it into something? I call it the OER just because the OER exists. It doesn't have to be, you know, or do you bring it into a multi-sector, regulator like the OER? Truth is that ERCA, although at the moment we regulate just the ICT sector, the law actually sets it up to be multi-sector at the time. And I think for us in this country, the question really has to be what makes sense. And in sense also has to include financial sense, use of resources, all of those things. What is the most efficient thing to do? The regulation is not cheap, right? And I just happen to believe that the more you can spread the burden across multiple sectors, the better it is for a country of all size. If you have a situation where, you know, you're in a country with 50 million inhabitants and 5,000 providers and so on, maybe the standalone ICT regulator might make sense. I don't really know if the analysis has been done in Jamaica, you know, for our circumstances here in Jamaica. Maybe it has, but I don't know. Like I said, the thing has to be based on, in the finances, what makes sense financially, resource-wise, and so on.
JP raised an interesting point about content, and it piggybacks on what I mentioned before about the fact that Jamaica is really good on content. The danger of content is, of course, if you don't have this convergence in how we manage content. If you think about the fact that, well, let's use Jamaica. Jamaica has probably 1 million television sets, but they have 3 million mobile phones. Which ones do you think are getting into the hands of children? So it's become the third screen. And therefore, if we don't manage that entire process, you go ahead and you're regulating television as if you're protecting your children, but they're consuming most of the content and will consume most of the content on their phone. So all of that, to me, just says we need to really be looking at this thing collectively.
Thank you. Please.
Afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Question for the panel.
Could you please state your name and...
Melissa Sutherland Campbell, Line. Right, question for the panel after just stating a little context, innovation in policy. I know lots of time we speak about innovation, we speak about technology, but in the region we tend to be very constrained in terms of innovation in policy because we tend to follow what happens elsewhere. I mean, benchmarks are good, but of course we want to see how they can be adapted locally. But because of how our industry has developed in terms of being a mobile, mostly society now, we really are in a position where we can have more innovation in policy, and those are some things we can think about. Now, in this regard, I want to ask the panel, what happens when it goes wrong? And what I mean by that, I mean, there are different approaches to policy making, and we try to get it right, but sometimes it goes wrong. So when it goes wrong, what do we do? Because when I listen to some of the discussions we're having on the panel, it's about really saying, we tried some things and they worked back then, but they don't work now, but they are entrenched. Or we tried something and it didn't work, we're still trying to find what works. It's difficult because nobody wants to say it didn't work the way we expected it to work. This was a perverse outcome. But what do we do when it goes wrong? Because that's what I'm hearing in some instances. It went wrong. It's not my fault. We get that, but what do we do? So
if you make bad policies and you put us there, you have the right to remove us. Now, I mean, going beyond that, which is the political consequence, your question is the impact it has on development, growth, etc. And I don't think there is any easy answer to that, necessarily. I mean, clearly, throughout our history, we have had good policies and we have had bad. The question may be, how do we ensure policy formulation is driven, whether it be by facts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, that may be the need to that may be the need to focus on that particular thing versus how you pick it up after it actually goes wrong. I mean, ultimately, from where I sit, I mean, nobody is going to vote out Zia, but they will vote us out. And I think, particularly when you get it wrong, the incumbent government tends to bear that responsibility, but it comes at a consequence and a cost to the country. But I don't know what the answer is necessarily, because as I said, I think there are blurred lines between the role of government in terms of policy and the role of the regulator. And there are instances where I know the regulator will believe the government has overstepped its bounds. There are times when we as government feel the regulator not moving fast enough to ensure that we implement the policy objectives that we have. So I don't have an answer to your question, sadly.
Annie?
Yeah, it's such a good question, Melissa, that it's one of these that really you can talk about it forever. But consider that whenever policies are made, they're always made with good intent, with good intentions, right? The government of the day recognizes a particular situation and they frame a policy to deal with it, hopefully in a few, looking at all the things and taking into account the views of all of the stakeholders that are available, and in the context of which you're speaking, perhaps even the views of the regulator, right? And so these policies are made. Yes, you're going to get some wrong. There's no question about that. That's the reality. I think the important thing is to have the capacity to be able to recognize that the policy, whatever it is in fact not producing the results you're looking for, and change it, right? So this process of review is something that I think has to be inbuilt in the whole system of governance. Now, having said that, one of the things that sometimes happens is not necessarily that the policy in the first instance was wrong, but that with the fluxing of time, the policy is no longer relevant. I have problems with that word. Relevant. Is no longer relevant. And we also need to be sufficiently aware to recognize when that happens and either throw it out or do the thing that. And the good case in point actually is, in fact, bring it really closer to home, is the policy that informed the 2000-2001 Telecoms Act, right? It was there It was intended to be there, as you all know, for 3 or 4 years, to operate for 3 or 4 years. It's 10 years, right? In fact, the changes that should have been, the changes and the review should have taken place within the time space of 3 or 4 years. And perhaps the issues that flowed out of it, out of that delay, wouldn't have arisen. So there's no real straight answer to it, but my own thinking is that, yeah, mistakes will be made, policy will be bad, the review process should always be there, the governance arrangement should allow for that. And you try to correct as you go along.
David Cox.
If I could have some permission to be a troublemaker, please. I wanted to ask some questions, really, and they're as follows. First thing is, who determines that you got it wrong? You know, I mean, who's making that determination? Is it the provider? Is it the public? Is it the government? Because I think what you need to figure out is, how do you measure success? And when you're talking about a specific type of activity and using telecoms, I certainly can't speak to the specific details of what has happened in the Jamaican market and with the OUR over the last 15 years, but I can speak in generalities which seem to point to a certain conclusion. And the generalities would be that prior to liberalization, prices were high, penetration was low for mobile, I'm sure, and the quality of service that was available and the services that were available were, I'm sure, not terribly attractive. Fast forward 15 years later and you have 3 million mobile handsets. And I'd like to suggest that actually it's possible that you have 3 million mobile handsets because it hasn't been heavily regulated. That light-handed regulatory approach actually made it an attractive market to invest in. And so you had real innovation at a marketing level, at a business level, and that's success. And I think also you have to be careful about some of your assumptions. I'm not speaking about you specifically, Melissa. I'm just talking about some of the assumptions when we talk about the role of policy and how it played out. Specifically in the context of talking about the mobile versus fixed. I mean, there seems to be an automatic assumption that, because you've got 3 million mobile handsets, so 100% penetration there, and only 15% penetration for fixed, it means you shouldn't be focusing on fixed, you should be focusing on mobile. Well, maybe not actually. Maybe because you've got 100% penetration, it means you're actually achieving what you want to achieve there. It's not about just, because those numbers are misleading. It's not about the absolute numbers, it's about the markets. Is there some level of real competition in the mobile market? Because if there's some real level of competition in the mobile market, then there's an argument for saying you don't need that regulation. Now, even though you only have 15% penetration in the fixed market, if there's no real competition in the fixed market, then there's an argument for regulation. If large hotels like this and companies that are in manufacturing, if they need internet access and they need leased lines, or they need certain types of services, and the only game in town is one company, I'm not saying that's the case in Jamaica, I don't know, but the only game in town is one company, it seems that you have an obligation to continue to regulate, because if you don't regulate, then those companies are going to be out on a limb when a company wants to raise prices for reasons that aren't connected to cost. So I think we have to be careful, and the argument also goes as well for the discussion about content and young people accessing content on phones. I think yes, it is true, their exposure there, that's the way they're going to interact with the information more and more. But when you're thinking about developing regulation, I think you have to, specific regulation and specific making specific types of regulatory decisions, the primary question has to be, what is the nature of this market? What are you trying to regulate? What's your objective? and what is the best way to do that. And in the case of certainly telecoms and voice, etc., it's not about regulating. I disagree. I don't think it's about regulating a technology versus one or not. I think it's about regulating markets, and there may be actually significant, measurable, objective differences between those markets.
Is there any other comment from the panelists? Otherwise, that was the last
I'm just
question.
glad David wasn't regulating Jamaica during the regulatory. Sorry? I'm just glad you weren't a regulator in Jamaica during that entire debate we had over last.
Very, very reasonable.
No, he makes some valid points, but I think that's just talking in generalities. We had a situation in Jamaica which, and this is just somebody coming from outside of the industry, where there were some glaring anomalies that I think the regulators, certainly every discussion I have with the regulators, the government, everybody recognized that it was a situation that required correcting, but it just never got corrected. For whatever reason, and in fact, special legislation had to be passed to get it done. So, I think the point Melissa is really referring to is the same point I got back to in terms of speed. Once we didn't, the powers that be decide that a change is required, who bells the cat, who then enacts whatever needs to be enacted and gets the action going? Because as I said, justice delayed is justice denied. And so even if you do make the corrective action, if you make it too late, nothing would have been accomplished.
Can I just make one quick point? Because I agree with you, except I wish you were describing the problem in a different way. What you're talking is about speed, and I like to talk about it in terms of accountability. And let me explain what I mean. One of the things that I'm very, very interested in a conceptual way all the time is about how efficiency in regulation depends on how you set a regulator up and the relationship between structures and actual performance. And one of the things that I want to suggest to you is that what you're really talking about is not so much speed of decision making, although that's important. You're talking about efficiency, but efficiency is directly related to issues of accountability. If the regulator is accountable to the provider, it will provide decisions in an efficient way. But it can only do that if it is institutionally set up in a way to deliver that. And one of the things I think that I think some discussion has to take place, some analysis has to take place in Jamaica. We need to think about whether the OUR was institutionally endowed with the structure in order for it to deliver the kind of accountability to you and to the government that both sides wanted. Because I would like to suggest, and at the risk of perhaps not remaining your friend, but I would like to suggest that institutionally, it seems that it was set up in a way that did not lead to promoting that sort of efficiency. And by that I mean, you set up this institution which was endowed with really fantastic, very bright people, but then control over spectrum was handed off to another institution, and then decision making about broadcasting and licensing, etc., was made by different institutions. And of course, if as a regulator you have no authority over things like spectrum, you don't, I mean, a huge part of your leverage as a regulatory authority is removed from you. It's kind of like,
But you sound like you're an advocate for a single.
Yes.
Well, I want to leave, I want to leave here on good terms with everybody. So
You're on good terms. You're on good terms.
But I do think there is an argument to be made for efficiency and for recognizing that in order to get the institution to be responsive to the needs of government at a policy level, you have to give it the power and the authority for it to actually do what you want it to do. You have to endow it, you have to set it up, design it in such a way that it has the authority and the independence, the resources, in order for it to do what you need it to do. So if you've set it up in a way that it is structurally weak, It cannot deliver.
Thank you. This panel has been excellent. They have had we have had an interesting dialogue, and I would like you to join me in applauding them. And I want to thank you, panelists. That actually brings us to the close of our formal proceedings, and we will follow with just closing remarks before inviting you to some refreshments. So, thank you. Please. Honorable Minister, distinguished guests, actually the Master of Ceremony was supposed to come and announce that I will be giving closing remarks, but unfortunately after good lunch he fell asleep. So I have to, the regulators sometimes have to be proactive to take an initiative. So I will just take a few minutes to deliver closing remarks and thank all of you for being here. The theme we had chosen was the regulation as a catalyst for sustainable development. And as I said earlier, you would have noticed during 2 days that OUR was just a passive participant in terms of interaction. It just was a facilitator, wanted to hear what various stakeholders and the interest had to convey to us, and we wanted to learn from you rather than comment on any remarks which were made. We did not want to get into any controversy because this is not a forum for that. We have had a great deal to chew on over the last 2 days. I would like to express my personal delight at the large turnout and the high level of support for this forum. I would also like to say thanks to all our contributors, participants, and the staff of the OUR who have worked tirelessly to make this a success. In the opening address, the most honorable Prime Minister's message not only underscored that regulation is a linchpin in development, but that tension between the regulator and the executive can be healthy. This point was reiterated by Honorable Minister Paulwell. Good stuff coming from the political directorate. Many important ideas emerged from the presentations and exchanges. We hope to provide you with a report on the proceedings at a later date. Actually, I want to again thank and congratulate the staff of the OUR. The whole proceedings are being streamed, as well as they have been videotaped, and we will be putting all of those together and make available to all who are interested. The report we will prepare will more focus on the lessons we have learned from this particular forum and the way going forward, what it is that the OUR should be focusing in its development, in its strategy, and in its business or corporate plan. We basically prepared a 3-year corporate plan, which is right now in development, and it should be out by the end of December. It will be submitted by the end of December. We have already issued our annual report, which is the 2011-2012 report, which is available on our website. Anybody who is interested in a copy, they can always ask for a hard copy. Allow me to highlight a few, however, the highlights of this particular forum, or for last 2 days, what we have discussed. We were reminded that the determination of what is a natural monopoly has both political and economic considerations, and the regulator must be mindful of this. The designation natural monopoly is neither static nor permanent. For evolution in both technology and economic thinking may result in yesterday's natural monopoly becoming today's competitive industry. And this point has been highlighted by a number of speakers during last 2 days. Ongoing challenges to the orthodoxies are critical to ensuring that we continue to search for optimality. Troublemakers are therefore critical. We must always ask. Thank you for bringing that jargon to our work and thinking. So we must always ask, what have we learned? What do we know? What do we not know? Not just what is best practice, but what is next practice. We were also reminded of the risks that liberalization can deliver, short-term benefits to consumers even while facilitating the re-emergence of monopoly tendencies. And I think that the last session, the interaction between a regulatory lawyer and the service provider has shown that how these can play. And there has, although we have a different situation, but there was a sort of a tendency which was developing, and the government has taken steps to address those particular issues. The regulatory certainty is the public capital in private investment. Note this has implications for lowering the risk premium in infrastructure investments. It is also perhaps fitting that coming out of our recent hurricane, we have been challenged to consider such matters as the effect of climate change on utilities, infrastructure, and consequently the view that we take of funding their maintenance. With respect to renewables, the minister indicated his policy position. As has been noted in this forum, the regulator is always guided by policy, particularly as set out in the law. Not unexpectedly, the consensus has been that regulators are needed by consumers, politicians, businessmen, and providers of investment funding. I am conscious, however, that consensus does not mean life will become easier. For us, as we have been reminded, the role of the regulator is to disappoint everyone. Perhaps one of the most insightful pronouncements on the role of the regulator was the observation that regulator ought to prevent the need for the minister to call the utility provider and vice versa. Ladies and gentlemen, I am sure that you will agree with me that the presentations and the discussions have vindicated, indeed reaffirmed, the theme of the forum. Regulation is an important catalyst for sustainable development. It was our pleasure to host you over these 2 days. We extend to you our thanks again and wish you good fortune as we separate. To our visitors from overseas, we also wish you pleasant and safe travel and hope your visit to Jamaica has been so pleasant as to invite frequent returns. With these remarks, I declare this public forum closed. Thank you.